As soon as Brent sits down, we can get started. Thank you, Brent. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming to this special event with Dr. Henry Emmons. Can you all hear me okay? This is the first session of Washburn Center's new Let's Talk Thought Leadership series. And the goal of this series is to connect, discuss, and raise awareness about children's emotional health. And over the next year, Washburn Center will be hosting a series of 4 community workshops, starting off tonight with Dr. Henry Emmons. Early in next year, we'll be welcoming Dr. Ann Garrity. We have a session with Dr. Bill Allen, and then Dr. Megan Gunner from the U next year. So we hope to see you at all of those future events as we get started. And tonight, I'm really honored and thrilled to introduce and welcome renowned author and psychiatrist, Dr. Henry Emmons, to talk about resilience. The physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being are often disconnected, and the care that we provide is often fragmented. But Dr. Emmons provides an integrative model with practical tools to cultivate resilience in ourselves, our families, our workplace, and our communities. And when I think about developing emotional resiliency, I think about a young girl who we worked with in our school-based mental health program in Eden Prairie named Evie. And Evie was struggling with really debilitating anxiety to the point where she couldn't go to school, she had trouble leaving her home, and it was overwhelming her and affecting her school, it was affecting her friendships, it was affecting her relationships, it was affecting her entire life. And she got connected with a therapist who is based right in a school in Eden Prairie, one of Washburn's therapists, and she was able to work not only on her anxiety, but to incorporate elements related to sleep and nutrition, and in Evie's case, music. And I'd like to share one of the things and ask you all to participate to get a sense of how does this go from this idea into something very real. So this is something that Evie shared in a performance on the stage at First Avenue at an event that we had with the Shine a Light Foundation focused on children's mental health. So Evie said, this is one of the things that we did. She called it and said, this is one of my anxiety management techniques. So hold out your hand. Just put your feet flat on the floor and sit up. Just take a nice, slow, cleansing breath. And holding in your hand, imagine that you're holding a lemon. That lemon is resting in your hand. And as you look at it, let any fears and anxieties and worries from your day just bubble to the top of your mind. And then as you look at that lemon, transfer those fears and anxieties into it. You can hold those in your hand and let them out of your mind, out of your body. And then take that lemon and squeeze it. And as you squeeze it, feel all of that fear and anxiety, whatever is troubling you and stressing you, release it and let it go. Now that work happens in the context of a caring, trusting, therapeutic relationship. And we're going to hear and talk more about relationships today. But right now I have the true honor of introducing Dr. Henry Emmons. Dr. Emmons is a psychiatrist who integrates nature and nutrition, mindfulness, and Buddhist teachings with compassion and insight in his therapeutic work and writing. Dr. Emmons developed the Resilience Training Program that's offered through the Penny George Institute and through his own private practice. And this program is based on ideas that he articulated in 2 books that he authored called The Chemistry of Joy and The Chemistry of Calm. And his whole career has really been animated by the desire to develop more integrative approaches to treating trauma, anxiety, and depression. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Henry Emmons.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm going to talk about a real problem in our country, in our society, one that we all know about. It's not hidden anymore, and that is the problem of mood, depression, anxiety, the really common mental health issues. And I want to frame it in a way that is really focused on resilience. So just talk a little bit about the problem, and then we'll talk about really what we can do about it and what we can help our kids do. So there's a study that has been going on for 100 years now. It's an epidemiological study that started in the year 1910 when a group of epidemiologists began to ask questions of a sampling of people associated with the US Census. So every 10 years, we have another sample of, and essentially they're asking questions that are very similar to what clinicians would ask to diagnose something like depression and anxiety. And so every 10 years now, we have a sampling of what is the kind of the overall state of our mental health in this country. And what it has shown is that every time it's been taken, the rates of these, what we think of as stress-related problems, like depression and anxiety, they've gone up about another 10%. So we have 10 samples, 10% increase each time. That's way more than 100% though, because of this compounding interest type of phenomenon. So another way to think of it is there's a very well-known psychologist named Martin Seligman who says that if you're born after World War II, your chances of becoming depressed are about 10 times higher than if you had simply been born around 1900. So something's shifted. What a lot of people don't know is that depression ranks as the #1 cause of disability in this country. And that's for any health problem, not just mental health, but all health problems. And that has been true for a long time in the United States. And it has been true in certain other developed countries where people are more stressed. But in other parts of the world, they've had much, much lower rates of things like depression. However, that is quickly changing. The World Health Organization says that by the year 2025, they expect depression will be the #1 cause of disability worldwide. So whatever we've got going on, the rest of the world has also got it going on, that same kind of phenomenon. Now, young people, teens, college, this is a survey about college students, which kind of reveals how common and just how stressed and strained college students are feeling. This is a nationwide survey that was actually done by Boynton here at the University of Minnesota, but it's looking at college counseling centers and college students across the country. And what they found, this is just really recent, just 2015, what they found is that during the college years, there's about a 33%, about a third of college students who will have a diagnosis, a significant diagnosis of a mental health problem. That's an increase, you can see, of 25% from just 8 years earlier, the last time the survey was done. And 35%, so a little more than a third, report that their stress levels are so high they cannot manage them. Some of you recognize the name of this author, Margaret Mitchell. She wrote Gone with the Wind. She also said this, or wrote this, that every problem has two handles. You can grab it by the handle of fear or by the handle of hope. And what I want to do tonight is for us to try to grab this by the handle of hope. Now, base this, everything I'm saying more or less is science-based. But it's things that we don't think about or we don't put together in quite this way, but we should, because there's a lot of reason for being hopeful, even in, even looking at some of the statistics and data that I just showed you. So the focus of my work really, and really this is the focus of the work here at Washburn, and that is to try to help people to restore their natural state of resilience. I believe everybody is born being resilient. We would not survive if we weren't. And some of the most resilient people that I know are actually people who have a severe mental illness, because they have so much to go against that they have to really kind of fight against in their lives, and yet they keep going, they keep working at it, they do, some people, a remarkable job of kind of keeping their spirits up, and even with all that against them. So being resilient doesn't mean everything goes great for you. It means that you can keep going in spite of that. You can face whatever you need to face and whatever is going on in your life, and still kind of hold yourself up and get yourself back up if you have been knocked down, no matter how many times it happens. I use this image, this metaphor of a water cooler, just a metaphor, but I imagine that inside each person's brain, they have a container that has an elixir that keeps you resilient, that keeps you kind of afloat and able to handle all the stresses in front of you. There's a brain chemical called serotonin that's a pretty good example of that sort of elixir. But the reason I try to use this with my patients, this image, is because so many people have come to see themselves as being somehow broken or flawed, or that there's just something so wrong with them that they'll never get right again. And I just don't believe that that's true. So I do believe that there are people who have a smaller container, smaller capacity for resilience. And I think that happens for two main reasons. One is genetics, and the second is early childhood experiences, especially difficult, traumatic experiences, or simply growing up in a family or a household that you did not feel safe or well loved or cared for. Those two things have a powerful effect, and some people then may have to go through their lives with a smaller capacity for this. However, in my view, it matters less how large your container is, and a lot more how much are you keeping it filled. So the question is really, what can we do and what can we help our clients do to keep kind of refilling this tank? There also are people, and I've seen a lot of people like this in my career, there are people who have a huge capacity for resilience. They're so fortunate. They were born with good genes, they were raised by a great family, and yet, at some point, often in the middle of their lives, they've got aging, ailing parents, they've got kids that are struggling, they may have a marriage that's falling apart. All these things come together. It doesn't matter how resilient, how big your capacity, you can still be taken down by these things. Anybody can. This is a universal kind of phenomenon. So here are some of the things, the broad categories of things that I think are eroding this natural resilient state. One is physical. It's brain health. It's the kind of chemical imbalances and toxicities that are in the environment or because of our lifestyle that we get off balance, out of kilter. The second is what I call an unsettled mind. You might call this stress or our perception or reaction to things that happen. But the big difference, I believe, between how we live today and how our ancestors lived, it's not that life is more stressful now than it used to be. In fact, in many ways, I think it's less stressful. I think that our ancestors, pioneers, or even going back before that, they had to contend with such huge challenges. It's hard for us even to get our minds around it. The difference is that our bodies are made to be able to face a really severe challenge as long as it doesn't go on forever. If it goes on forever, we're in trouble. And that's what's happening now. The challenges might not be so big, but we live with this constant state of stress that never completely goes away. That's really hard for us to stay balanced in the face of. And then thirdly is what I call the illusion of separation. Many people, you know people like this, maybe at times you yourself feel this way, believe themselves to be basically on their own, basically isolated, kind of in this really challenging life without a lot of support, without a lot of connection. I don't believe that this is true at a deep level. I don't think that any of us is really as separate from one another as we perceive ourselves to be. And yet, you know, I do know a lot of people, clients and others, who, for all practical purposes, feel really alone, really isolated, and that is the hardest thing to overcome if you have any kind of these mental health challenges. So, so with this being so common, how are we doing? How effectively are we treating something like depression? This is a survey being done in the state of Minnesota. Minnesota is really great at trying to improve upon healthcare for certain conditions. So diabetes is one and depression is another, that they're tracking through surveys done in primary care clinics, tracking to see how effectively are we treating something like depression. So there's 115 clinics in the state that are participating. Almost all of them in the Twin Cities are part of this. So if any of you have been in your primary care clinic lately, and especially if you reported any problem with stress or anxiety or sleep, you've probably been asked to fill out this questionnaire. It's called a PHQ-9. 9 simple questions related to mood or anxiety problems. If your score on that questionnaire is greater than 9, you're considered to be clinically depressed and you're offered a treatment. Let me just ask you, what do you suppose that treatment is that you're offered? It's a medication. That's what this is showing, is how effective are we? We're trying really hard not to let people fall through the cracks, trying to catch anyone who might be struggling with this, and then offering them a treatment. That's really well-intentioned. But this is what it's showing so far. There are only 10 of these 115 clinics who do better than 10%, or excuse me, better than 20% rate of remission. Remission is where your symptoms go way down, below a score of 5. Only 10 out of 115 clinics. The average is closer to 8 to 10% rate of remission. When I did my training, this was kind of early, this is a while ago, this is early in the use of the new psychotropic drugs, the new classes of drugs. Prozac was the first of the new drugs. Before that, hardly anybody wanted to take medication for depression because the side effects were so terrible. Once Prozac and Zoloft and others came along, the side effects weren't as bad, so many, many more people are treated. So going back, before many available treatments, a lot of people chose not to be treated. And so then we just kind of watch what happened without treatment. Within 6 months, 40 to 50% of people have recovered if they do nothing. Here, the best is 23 to 29%. Something's not right there. Now, this is my opinion, but if you had 100 people who go into a clinic, medical clinic, and they are diagnosed with this questionnaire as having depression, 100 people, how many of them do you think actually have clinical depression out of that 100? They're diagnosed based on this. I think it's only about 20%. I think the other 80% have a totally different condition that goes by the name of an adjustment disorder. That's just the name we use to code the condition. But an adjustment disorder, by definition, it is stress-related. The person is having a hard time adjusting to whatever's going on in their lives, and it shows up like depression. But it's a different thing than somebody who's really got a biochemical problem. So 80% of people being treated by and large with medications, not doing so well, and then you've got another problem, which is for many of them, they go on a medication and they stay on it for so long, they have a hard time coming off of it. That is an extremely common phenomenon. So we've got to do better than this, and especially with working with young people, we just can't be continuing to do this kind of huge experiment without giving people some kind of skill, some other things that they can do to try to get things right again. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the program I developed at the Penny George Institute, now do it in our own practice, called resilience training. Essentially, we are pulling together these three things. Good solid nutrition that is personalized for each individual. Not everybody is told to eat the same way because our bodies are so different. So it does need to be personalized, but good nutrition. Doing some kind of fitness or movement. And again, we personalized it because you can't tell everybody to do the exact same exercises. It just doesn't work. And then finally, incorporating a variety of skills that fall under this category we call mindfulness, which is really learning how to become better at dealing with your own thoughts and your own emotions. We did an 8-week group. We studied it because we were commissioned by Alina's own human resource department to study our own employees. Alina is a big organization. We had such a response to this study. In 2 weeks, we had 450 people who wanted to participate, which tells me, among other things, that healthcare professionals are suffering just like everybody else, maybe even a little bit more so. And so we couldn't take 450 people. We took 40 people. We were very careful to screen out conditions like an adjustment disorder, other personality problems or whatnot. We only took people in the study who had major depression. And this is what we found. At the end of the 8 weeks, the two treatment groups are the kind of greenish and red, and the purple or blue group was the control group, which was really a group that went through the program, but they had to wait 6 months before they did it. So while they waited, they served as the control. The two treatment groups ended up with a score in that same questionnaire, that PHQ-9, of less than 4. Their average score was about 3, which is complete remission. Everybody improved, every single person. Not everybody reached full remission, but 60% of people did, as compared to about 25% at best when we do treatment as usual. Now, I don't have this slide, but we continued to do these surveys for 12 months, and people continued to feel better. The recovery held, even though we offered no additional treatment, but it held for at least 1 year. So I want to talk to you about why this kind of approach works, and I'm going to couch this in these 3 areas of neuroscience, brain science: genetic expression, neurogenesis, and neuroplasticity. We all kind of grew up being taught that when we are conceived at conception, we get half of our DNA from our mothers and half from our fathers, and it stays with us throughout our lifetimes. It doesn't change. And at least what I remember is learning that is really the important aspect of our genes. It's what shows up in that blueprint that we call DNA. And it's represented here by that spiral helix. But for many years, after the discovery of DNA, for many years, scientists were puzzled because there seemed to be a lot of genetic material around the double helix that they didn't know what it did. They didn't know what its function was. They called it junk DNA because they just assumed it didn't have any real purpose. It actually has a very important purpose. It's like a series of channels or gateways, and they open up or they close depending upon your life circumstances and your lifestyle. So it reacts to your environment and to what's going on inside your body. And if certain of these channels open up, and let's say you have a gene or a series of genes for an illness like anxiety, depression, bipolar illness, if those channels open up, then the illness shows up. But you may have the gene and go through your whole life and never, ever show any signs of the illness because it was never triggered. These channels were never opened up. We also now believe that not only are there circumstances that open these channels up, that turn on a gene for an illness, but you can also turn them off again. So even if you've had an illness like this for a long period of time, if you can find the right keys that shut this down, you can literally turn it off and the illness can go into remission. It can get quiet again. That's really what we want to focus on, is what can we do to not activate the bad genes that show up as illness, and also what can we do to turn off the ones that have already showed up. Here are some of the things that we know of. This list is going to grow, certainly. But already we know that things like alcohol and tobacco, they turn on certain illness genes if they're used excessively. Endocrine disruptors, which are things found in our environment. Think particularly about adolescents who are exposed to all kinds of hormones in their food, or eating food, animals that have been treated with too many antibiotics, or getting toxins, through plastics, or that we use so frequently. There's all kinds of things in our environment that we can't totally avoid, but where we can, we really should put our efforts into that. And then the effects of long-term stress. Long-term stress is a trigger for illness. I think it's woven into our bodies. I think it was originally meant to be some way of survival, because we need to respond to our environment. But there's so many things now that are triggering us, that are activating these. It's no longer helpful. It's no longer for survival. It's actually creating problems. And then there are some other things. There are positive things that we can do that actually turn off these illness genes, including the bright colors in fruits and vegetables, the really bright ones, but a whole range of colors, not just greens, but reds and yellows and others. And also exercise or movement. I'm going to say more about this because the kind of exercise that you need to do for this is not what most of us think of as exercise. It can be pretty modest. And then the cultivation of positive emotions, which I'll also speak a little bit more about later. So the first root of resilience, I call root of resilience, is to try to balance brain chemistry through diet first, the foods that we choose, and then secondly, if food is not enough, to consider some really good, well-researched natural therapies, and there are actually quite a few of them. Vitamins, minerals, herbs, amino acids, things that help your brain work closer to the way it's supposed to. And then if that doesn't work, then maybe you consider a medication. We're doing it in reverse, and I think we're making a mistake by doing that. Diet can get really confusing in a hurry because you hear such dramatically different things from different people, different experts. Michael Pollan, who a lot of you know, you probably read some of his work, he was given a challenge to describe, because this is all so confusing, he was challenged to describe how to eat well in 7 words or less. And he did it. Here's what he said: eat food. Now that sounds like a no-brainer, right? But you know what he means here is to eat real food. Real food, by his definition, is food that your grandparents or great-grandparents would have recognized as food. It has not been altered or changed in the ways that we all know about. Not too much. Again, sounds really simple. It's really not simple to follow this. But this is the most common finding in all of the research on nutrition, and that is to not overdo calories, and especially simple calories, simple sugar calories. Because one of the absolute worst things you can do for your brain, this is true for aging, this is true for brain development when you're young, this is true for mood and anxiety problems. The worst thing you can do in terms of diet is to let your blood sugar crawl up a little bit too high. And it doesn't have to get very high. So eating in the way our ancestors ate, their blood sugar was pretty stable. Why? Mostly because they had so much fiber in their diet, so much more than we do. And when you have a lot of fiber, it takes a long time to break the food down, and so your blood sugar is pretty steady. I like sweets just as much as the next person, probably more so. I admit I have a sweet tooth. And I don't totally avoid it. I don't believe in being rigid about it, but I do believe in taking care and just learning not to overdo this, which is not so easy to do. And then mostly vegetables or mostly plants. Again, the bright colors. Second thing we'll talk about here is what's known as neurogenesis. And this is a term a lot of people are a little less familiar with. Neurogenesis means that your brain is constantly repairing itself. It is replacing brain cells that have died with new ones. Now, as we age, we do lose brain cells. We don't have as many as we did when we were young. You kind of reach your peak at a certain age in life, and then it just kind of goes downhill a little bit. What I like to remember, though, is that the way the brain is designed is a little bit like a forest. So if you think about a young forest, when there's lots and lots of trees coming up, it's kind of like what your brain is like when you're young. You got all kinds of brain cells. As you age, as the forest ages, there's not as many trees, but they are big, and they are branching all over, and their roots are really spreading out and connecting. That is what happens to a healthy brain as you age, so that you don't really necessarily lose that much function. If you've really, kind of taken care of your brain, you have a lot of rich connections and these great big, robust neurons. But we are always producing, throughout our lifetimes, producing new ones. All of us are. But some of us more successfully than others, because these brain cells, in order to survive, they really have to connect to a lot of other brain cells. They've got to send out a lot of different projections, kind of like a really healthy plant with good, healthy roots. So there is a brain chemical. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but it functions like a fertilizer or like a root starter. So if you're a gardener and you have a really expensive, nice plant you want to survive, you might start it out with a root starter that makes it branch out, the roots branch out more. That's what this does. It acts kind of like miracle grow for your brain. And there are things you can do to increase its function at any age. Here are some of the ways we know of. Exercise shows up again. Now, I do need to tell you that this research was done on lab rats, and there's a very big difference between human beings and rats when it comes to exercise. And that is, when you put one of those treadmill deals in a rat cage, they will actually use it. It's true. They love it. So, if it's there, that circular wheel deal, they'll just run for hours a day. That does not happen with most of us. But the kind of exercise does not need to be strenuous. It just needs to be repeating some kind of repetitive movement that you do over and over again. So gentle, light aerobic activity. Walking is perfect for this. In fact, the research shows that if people who exercise a lot, really vigorously, it actually turns down this miracle grow. I'm not sure why that would be, but that's what the research shows. So an enriched environment, and again with rats, it's pretty easy. You give them a toy to play with, you give them another rat to play with, so they have a playmate, and then you challenge their brain by making them do something that's hard, like a maze or something. It's not that different for human beings. We need toys, we need playmates, and we need to do things that we find hard, that really challenge us, that make us a little bit frustrated, because it's in resolving that frustration that your brain really does good things, good healthy growth. So learning something that you have not learned or done before, challenging yourself. This is important throughout our lifetimes. Oh, sorry, I wanted to finish up on this slide. Diet shows up again with some of the same things we heard before. And then serotonin, that brain chemical, is also really important. There's a lot of things we can do in terms of nutrition and movement to help support serotonin. And then finally, social connection. Again, easier with lab animals than human beings, but it is essentially just being with others in a kind of a healthy way. Now, age also makes a difference. As we age, we are not as good at making new brain cells. But when you compare all 6 of those things, the 5 listed here plus age, which one do you think is the most important for building more healthy brain cells? It is social connection. Social connection beats everything else. So the person who studied this literally had old rats hanging out with other old rats. And they were building more of these new brain cells than the young rats that were, running and eating it right and doing everything else. Social connection is the glue. It is the thing that allows for a lot of other things to go wrong, and it's still incredibly protective. The second root of resilience is what I refer to as movement. You need to kind of stress your body. You need to do something that depletes your body's energy so that you get better at making it. And that's what we call exercise, or I just think of it as movement. Every cell in your body has to create its own energy, and it does that by being forced to do it. So here are the guidelines for adults in the US by the Center for Disease Control for a healthy amount of exercise, physical activity. 2.5 hours a week, or 75 minutes if it's vigorous. Now, what percentage of people, I'm not going to ask about you, but what percentage of Americans do you think get this much physical activity? 25. It's about 20 to 25%. Think about our ancestors about 100 years ago, when most people made a living through some kind of physical work, largely in agriculture. They were outdoors, they experienced the seasons, they experienced sun, they moved their bodies for probably 6 to 10 hours a day, almost every day. And throughout all of human history, until recently, that was true for almost all people. We live completely differently by being so sedentary, and we simply are not designed for that. We have not evolved to be so sedentary. Kids need more. They need at least an hour a day. It needs to be more vigorous. But if you just let kids play with other kids, this automatically happens, and then some, because they play more than this. And if you watch them, they are really doing strenuous activity, if they're just allowed to play as kids play. Movement does not have to be what we think of as exercise. This is a Mayo Clinic physician who studies what he calls non-exercise activated thermogenesis, NEAT, NEAT. And he's also the guy that developed this treadmill desk. It's a treadmill desk. You set the treadmill at a very, very low pace. You're not even really walking. You're just moving a little bit, but you're doing it all day long. I gave a talk earlier to the staff here at Washburn, and I suggested that if they just asked nicely, maybe Washburn would fork up the money to pay for $10,000 per desk for their staff. I don't think they had a reaction kind of like you did. You don't have to do that. Here's what you could do instead. Every 15 or 20 minutes, just stand up. And then you can sit back down. Simply standing up and sitting back down. About 30 times a day, you're getting a lot of the same benefits as our ancestor did by moving and keeping themselves active. Doing it that often is not that easy, mainly because it's hard to remember. When I was researching my last book, it was about the book about aging. That's when I came across this research, and so I decided I was going to try it. And I set my timer on my cell phone to go off every 20 minutes. And at first, I was trying to research and write. It was driving me crazy, because every 20 minutes I had to stand up and kind of disrupted my train of thought. But after about 2 days, that didn't happen anymore. I was able to keep my train of thought. It wasn't distracting me, and it helped me remarkably to be more efficient. I didn't need to take breaks as often. They weren't as long. I was able to stay much more focused and productive, but I still could not remember to do it because I just get absorbed unless I had my timer set. Every 15 to 20 minutes. The third root of resilience is to align ourselves with nature. I have at the top of this slide, this is actually the title of a book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, written by a neuroscientist. It's a really great book. And he says that in nature, they don't suffer from these stress-related illnesses because they don't suffer from chronic stress. But people do. And this was a photoshopped picture here. But it does kind of illustrate that sometimes it's really stressful to be an animal in the wild. Really stressful. So I want to quickly paint a picture of you of an actual video that is meant to help us understand something about trauma, how human beings can learn from nature to deal better with trauma. And if you imagine something like this, take away the motorcycle, change the animals around. You see a herd of antelope, African antelope. They're just grazing peacefully. And then on one side of your screen, you see a cheetah start to race toward them. And if you've ever seen this, the entire herd will crouch, and then they'll leap and they'll run like they're one organism. It's very cool to see. But the cheetah has its sights set on just one poor gazelle, one poor antelope. And the cheetah is a little bit faster. So he gradually catches up, and then he leaps on the back, pulls the antelope down, puts its jaws around its neck, and then the antelope goes stiff. The body goes stiff, and I think it has just died. It's just been killed. It hasn't been killed. There is fight or flight, and then there is one more option, which is to freeze. It's automatic. It's a reflex. Presumably it was built in the hopes that maybe a predator would not be interested in you if they thought you were dead already. So sure enough, the cheetah gets up and leaves. You don't see it again. The camera stays on the antelope, and before long it's moving. It starts to move its body. And then it gets up on its knees, and it's just really wobbly. Then it gets up on its feet, and it's even more wobbly. And then something really bizarre happens. Anybody know what it is? It starts to shake. Just violently shake its entire body. And it goes on for a long time, at least 2 or 3 minutes as I'm watching it. Kind of got lost in it, but it seemed like forever. And then it stops shaking, and then the strangest thing of all happens. It walks back to the herd and starts grazing like none of this had ever happened. It looks just as peaceful as it did before. That is nature's way of dealing with stress. Really, really big stress. And the shaking is apparently nature's way of rebooting, regenerating, restarting the computer. You know how when your computer gets that circle of death, it won't, well, it's like shutting it off and starting it up again so it starts to work again. Now, there's two stress hormones that are at play here. If you were to measure them, the moment that the animal senses the cheetah, adrenaline shoots through the roof. That prepares you for fight or flight. Totally normal, but it cannot keep you going at that pace for any more than about 20 minutes. And then you're just exhausted. So that's just a pure survival kind of thing. And then that wears off really quickly. The second hormone is called cortisol. It actually takes probably about 20 minutes before it starts to rise, and then it stays elevated for about 24 hours in this case. That's what's normal. Cortisol is doing some very important things. It is making the animal tired, and it's making it hungry. So if you were to watch it for the next 24 hours, what would it be doing? It would be eating or sleeping. It would be recovering from this incredibly stressful thing. It's what our bodies want us to do. And if you're only doing this for 24 hours, this is perfectly fine. You can eat a lot, and you're not going to mess with your weight or your metabolism. But if you do it for weeks or months or years, you're in trouble. And you start to gain weight right in the middle. That's where that stress weight tends to find itself. And then there's a third thing that cortisol is doing, which is also really important. It is triggering the memory center, the hippocampus, to get more active. Why is that? Because you don't ever want this to happen again. You want to remember everything you can about this so you can avoid this in the future. That is great if you're doing that for 24 hours. If you're doing that for a long time, it's incredibly hard on these memory cells. And if they're triggered, if they're stimulated too much for too long, many of them will die off, and that's one of the reasons people develop memory problems as they age. Some of it can be regenerated, but if it's too much or goes on too long, it's very hard to do that. And so sleep is really one of nature's ways of resetting this. I told the group earlier, we had a gathering before this, about how I consider sleep to be the linchpin for mental health. I think it's the most important aspect of self-care. I think it's the most important trigger for certain kind of mental health problems. And if you do nothing else but focus on sleep until it's right, you're doing a lot to protect yourself or your kids or your family members from future problems, because it is so crucial to keeping the brain healthy. And you may know that the average person nowadays sleeps about 6 hours a night. In 1900, it was closer to 9 hours. That's a really big change in a very short period of time. I want to point this out at this time of year because it's such a helpful, simple tool. It's called a dawn simulator, and you can get some that look like this, but there's some others that are probably more popular now. And the reason I like it is because it is the absolute simplest thing you could possibly do to prevent seasonal depression. Seasonal depression is all about biorhythm, circadian rhythm, which is really your 24-hour cycle. And it gets really messed up when the days get so short. You produce a lot of melatonin, so you want to sleep more. And melatonin is produced at the expense of serotonin. So you get sleepy and you get depressed. And we all know what that feels like. And so if that's going on for you, or say for a teenager who's just out of rhythm with their sleep cycle, using this, you just plug it in. I have one myself beside my bed, and I just love it. It just has made such a difference because it starts to brighten your room about a half hour before your alarm is set. And if you just keep it set the same time every day, your brain thinks the sun is rising at the same time every day, even though it's obviously not. And then if you're someone who has a tendency to get really sleepy in the early evening in the winter, you should get a light box, and you should use it at least once a day at around 5 o'clock, 5 or 6 o'clock, because you're getting so sleepy, well, right about now, actually, because that melatonin release usually occurs about 90 minutes after sunset. And when the sun is setting at 4:30, it's pretty hard to stay awake. And if you do, then you often get a second wind, right? And then it's really hard to fall asleep. So just using light smartly, wisely in the winter can go a really long ways toward preventing seasonal depression. The other thing I've done for myself, which has really been helpful, is in the winter, I hardly have any light on in the house after 8 p.m. Like, I'm really, really strict about it because, again, researching my last book came to realize even just reading with a typical, table lamp or sofa lamp, it's too bright, and it sends your brain into this believing that the sun is setting really late, and so you don't release melatonin for a good 90 minutes after that. So from about 8 o'clock on, lights go really dim in my house. And in the mornings, you want a lot of bright light. It really, really can make a difference. Last thing I'll talk about, and I do know we need to wrap it up here. Last thing I'll talk about is neuroplasticity. Some of you have heard this term. Neuroplasticity means that your brain is capable of change throughout your lifetime. It never stops changing and creating these new pathways. It never stops. The question is, are we creating these pathways that we want, that are good for us, or are we creating ones that are really harmful? And I can tell you that most of the time, we have no idea that we're even doing it because we're not aware. We don't see it happening, but we are doing it by repeating thoughts and images and beliefs, and also by having emotional reactions to things. So I want to share with you a study that points out how powerful this is and how important your mind is at creating your day-to-day experience. This was a study done with college students who were given the instructions to practice a keyboard, a song on a keyboard for 2 hours a day for 2 weeks, but with just one hand. And the idea was they were going to practice with, let's say, the right hand, and then they were going to measure the left brain to see what changed in the part of the brain that deals with hand movement. Okay? So remember, the brain crosses with movement. So they did this for 2 hours a day for 2 weeks, and sure enough, the part of the brain that deals with right-handed movement grew by about 25%. It got bigger, literally the brain got bigger. It's really similar to someone who wants to grow bigger arm muscles. They take a dumbbell, and let's say 20 times a day they go like this. In 2 weeks or so, you're going to have bigger muscles. Then they did something really interesting. They had another group of students do the same thing, same exact instructions with one big difference. They told them not to actually move their hand, just imagine it. So this is all just happening in the mind. They had the exact same 25% growth of the brain part that deals with hand movement. Now, I know what you're thinking. This means I don't actually have to exercise, right? I can just imagine doing this. No, don't go there. The fifth root of resilience is to learn how to skillfully face your emotions. We had a conversation just before this about this topic, that so many of our young people are not given the opportunity to learn how to face difficult emotions because we, as parents, are so darn protective of them. I fell into this trap myself. I don't think we're doing them any favors. They have to learn, we all have to learn how to face and in some ways master these difficult emotions. They're not as scary as we tend to think that they are, unless it's a really, really big, big episode of something. But by and large, we need to befriend them. We need to be able to come to terms with them and know how to deal with them. The sixth root of resilience is to cultivate a good heart. And by that I mean really learning to love well. This goes back to those slides where we were talking about cultivating positive emotions. Well, there's hardly a better emotion than compassion toward others, or loving kindness, or generosity, or gratitude. Those kinds of things we can develop if we do it purposely, we keep repeating it. We start with an image in our mind. We see ourselves with kindness. We accept ourselves as we are. If we can do those things repeatedly, you will change your brain. But it does have to be conscious, purposeful, and repeated. But it can't stop with your mind. You have to take this kind of thing into action. You have to eventually act kindly, act with compassion, act with generosity. It starts in the mind, and that's really important, but it's got to be translated into your life. And then finally, the seventh root of resilience is to create deep connections. I think the most powerful thing for protecting us at any age is to feel deeply connected to something outside of ourselves. And that might mean other people. That might mean doing something that feels really meaningful, that feels purposeful. It might mean having some kind of a religious or spiritual conviction, but it does mean getting out of ourselves and our self-absorption, our focus on ourselves and what's wrong with our lives. The Dalai Lama says we can live without religion and meditation, but we cannot survive without human affection. I'm going to close with a bit of silliness here. Some of you remember this movie, City Slickers. I talk to some groups that have no idea what I'm talking about. Who is this Billy Crystal guy, anyway? So, if you remember this movie, Billy Crystal was younger then, as we all were, and he portrayed this kind of early midlife crisis. He was kind of a neurotic guy, and his friends convinced him to go to the Dude Ranch, where he met this crusty old character named Curly, played by Jack Palance. Now, Jack Palance, Curly, kept talking about the one thing you could do. Remember this, you can see he's kind of, Billy Crystal's holding up his one finger, because he kind of led them on this entire movie that there's this one thing you could do and you'd be happy or you'd get your life together, but he wouldn't tell them what it was. And here at the very end, Billy Crystal is badgering him, and he is finally going to break him down. And then Curly has a heart attack and he dies. Right. So he never was able to tell him. Now, he kind of figured it out on his own, but I'm going to tell you right now the one thing that you can do. There is one thing we can do, and the happiest people are those who can do it to the limit of their ability. We can be completely present. We can be all here. We can give all our attention to the opportunity before us. I have the great good fortune of being able to work with people who are suffering in some way. And it gives me an opportunity to practice this over and over again, being completely present. I am not perfect at it, but I can do it a lot better than I used to be able to. And I know that each and every one of you has opportunities. It might be working with someone who's struggling. It might be, connecting with people in your neighborhood. It might be, being with a child or grandchild who's needs some guidance. It could be any of these things. It's almost always some kind of interaction with another person. but it is an opportunity where we have frequently to become more and more able to bring our full selves to it without the distractions, without the getting lost in the chatter, but just really being there. So I thank you so much for being here tonight, and I hope you all become more resilient in the next few months.
We all say a huge thank you again to Dr. Henry Emmons for sharing everything with us tonight. Thank you so much. I would also really like to express my gratitude to two generous supporters that really made this evening possible. I called out Brent earlier, but I see Brent in Maryland, Brent Marmo from Agency Squid. They helped to make this event possible and were a lead sponsor, and I'm looking for Leslie Crosby as well. These kind of events can't happen without the support, the generous support of donors and sponsors. So thank you both so much. This evening was possible thanks to both of you. Can we give them a big round of... I hope to see you all again at the next session in January. And as we wrap up, in addition to going home and eating a kale salad and sleeping well and throwing away all the old plastic Tupperware, the other thing I would like to ask everyone to do is living with and experiencing anxiety and depression can be profoundly isolating. And maybe a little more so in Minnesota, we have a tendency to keep our distance. If you see someone struggling, please reach out. Take a walk with them, listen to them. It can be literally life-changing and life-saving. And as Dr. Emmons talked about, the main thing I'm going to take away from this is we're not in this alone, and we need to reach out and connect with each other and support each other. We've tried to do that here tonight as I knock over his green tea. And we try to do that every day through the therapeutic work that we do here at Washburn. So thank you so much for being a part of this, and I hope to see you all again in January. Good night.